The last light of day bled through the window of the adobe house, painting everything the color of old wounds. Nayland sat motionless in the chair her husband had built 15 years ago, back when his hands were still strong, back when the future seemed like something worth building toward. The turquoise necklace lay heavy against her palm, half of it smooth stones her mother had strung together in the Apache way, half of it a gold wedding band that had never quite fit the life she had tried to live. She did not cry. The Apache part of her had learned long ago that tears were a luxury, something you saved for when survival was no longer in question. The French blood from her father, whoever he had been, had taught her nothing useful except perhaps how to endure being caught between worlds that wanted no part of her. Outside, the wind moved through the bone chimes Jacob had helped her hang along the perimeter, a warning system disguised as decoration. The hollow music they made was neither Apache nor white, just like her, just like this place that belonged to no one and everyone. Her hands still carried the red dirt from this morning's burial. She had not washed them, could not bring herself to wash away the last physical connection to her son, even though Daniel had been in the ground for 7 days now. 7 days since the fever took him. 7 days since she had stopped believing in the God that Jacob's people prayed to, the God that seemed to listen only to those whose skin was the right color, whose blood was pure. The scarlet fever, the white doctor from Fort Grant had said, common in children, nothing to be done. He had not stayed long, had not looked her in the eye, had collected his fee and ridden away as if the death of a half-breed child in a nowhere ranch was just another afternoon's work. But Nayland knew fevers, had seen them take whole villages when she was young, before her mother had died, before she had become truly alone. And this fever had come too fast, burned too hot, taken Daniel in 3 days when it should have taken a week or more. The water from the well had tasted strange that last morning, metallic and bitter, but she had said nothing because who would believe her? Who would investigate the death of one mixed-blood boy on the edge of the territory that the government had not quite decided what to do with? She opened her hand, let the necklace pool in her palm like a small broken promise. The turquoise stones caught the dying light. These were from the sacred places, the mountains her mother's people believed held the bones of the earth itself. Jacob had given her the wedding band on a cold morning in 1861, when the war back east was just beginning, and the West was still a place where you could run to, still a place where reinvention felt possible. He had been so young then, only 23, fleeing something he would not name for years. She had been 20, fleeing nothing, because she had never belonged anywhere long enough to need escape. They had found each other the way lost things sometimes do not, through seeking, but through the simple fact of being in the same broken place at the same broken time. Nayland rose from the chair, moved through the house that still smelled like Jacob, even though he had been dead for 3 years. Tobacco and leather and the particular scent of a man who worked with his hands, who understood that survival was about more than strength, that it was about knowing when to bend and when to break and when to simply endure. She lit no lamps. The darkness suited her mood, suited the way she needed to think right now. In the corner of the bedroom, hidden behind a false panel that only she and Jacob had known about, was the journal he had kept. She had not read it since his death, could not bear to see his handwriting, the careful way he formed his letters, as if words were something precious that could not be wasted. But tonight, with Daniel fresh in the ground, and a strange emptiness spreading through her chest, like water soaking into sand, she needed to know. Needed to understand why Jacob had chosen this particular piece of land, why he had built here, why he had been so insistent that they never leave, never sell, never give up this place, even when the droughts came and other homesteaders fled east with defeat in their eyes. The panel came away easily. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was the journal, along with maps she had never fully examined, papers with seals she did not recognize, and a small leather pouch that rattled when she lifted it. She carried everything to the kitchen table, finally lit a single candle. The journal fell open to a page dated 1863, 2 years after their marriage, 1 year after Daniel was born. The writing was in English mostly, but scattered throughout were words in her mother's language, the Chiricahua dialect that fewer and fewer people spoke, now that the government was forcing the bands onto reservations. Jacob had learned the language from her mother before she died, had spent hours with the old woman learning not just words, but the way the Apache understood the world, the way they read land and water, and the intentions of other men. Nalin began to read, her finger tracing the lines, as if she could absorb meaning through touch as much as sight. The one they called Geronimo came to me today. He knew about Fort Callahan, knew what I had seen there, what I had refused to do. He said my debt could be paid in protection rather than blood. There is a place, he told me, where the water rises from the earth's bones, where the turquoise still sleeps in the mountains, where his people have prayed for generations. The army will come for it eventually, he said. The mining companies will come for it. But if a white man holds the deed, if a white man's wife has Apache blood, if the law sees it as settled land, then perhaps it can remain what it has always been, sacred, untouchable. He asked me to be that white man. He asked Nalin's mother to give her blessing, to give her daughter. I said yes before I understood what I was agreeing to. I would say yes 1,000 times more now. Some debts are worth carrying forever. Nalin's hands trembled. She set the journal down, looked up at the ceiling as if she could see through wood and adobe to the stars that her mother had taught her to read. The stars that guided the Apache through darkness. Jacob had not chosen her out of love alone. He had chosen her because she was a key, a legal bridge between worlds, a way to hold land that might otherwise be taken. The realization should have hurt more than it did, should have felt like betrayal. But she had always known, had she not somewhere deep in the place where truth lives, before it becomes words, that their marriage was built on more than simple affection. She had been useful to him, and he had been useful to her. And somewhere in that mutual utility, they had found something real, something worth protecting. Nalin kept reading, flipping through pages that detailed meetings with Geronimo, with other Apache leaders whose names she recognized from childhood stories. Jacob had been more than a homesteader. He had been a guardian, a keeper of secrets, a white man who had somehow earned the trust of people who had every reason to trust no white man ever again. And then, near the end of the journal, the entries became encrypted, a code she did not recognize. But scattered between the coded passages were fragments in Apache small pieces she could read. The water remembers, the stone remembers. What is taken by force returns to the earth. What is given freely multiplies. Nalin must know, but not yet. When I am gone, she will understand. She will protect what I could only hide. Nalin closed the journal, her heart beating faster now. She reached for the leather pouch untied. The cord poured the contents onto the table. 3 items fell out. A small piece of turquoise, unpolished and raw. A fragment of paper with coordinates written in Jacob's hand. And a tiny carved figure, Apache made, representing one of the mountain spirits, the Gan dancers that her mother had told her protected the sacred places. The coordinates meant nothing to her at first, but when she unfolded one of the maps, spread it across the table, she saw that they marked a location on their own property in the area Jacob had always called the Red Hills, the place he had forbidden her to go without him, the place he had said was dangerous because of unstable rock and hidden crevices. He had been lying, protecting her perhaps, or protecting something else. Nalin made her decision in the space between one breath and the next. She would go to the Red Hills tomorrow. She would see what Jacob had hidden, and then she would decide what to do with the truth. She returned the journal and maps to their hiding place, but kept the turquoise, the coordinates, and the carved figure. These she wrapped in a cloth and tucked into her shirt close to her heart, where secrets belonged. Sleep did not come easily that night. She lay in the bed she had shared with Jacob, staring at the ceiling, listening to the night sounds of the desert. Coyotes in the distance, the bone chimes marking the wind's passage, and underneath it all, a silence that felt like waiting, like the land itself was holding its breath to see what she would do next. Morning arrived cold and bright, the kind of autumn day that made the desert beautiful in its harshness. Nylan dressed in the practical clothes she wore for hard riding, dark pants, and a loose shirt that would not catch on brush boots that Jacob had made for her from leather he had traded for in Santa Fe. She braided her hair tight against her skull in the Apache way, not the loose style she usually wore to appease the white settlers who came through occasionally. Today, she was not pretending to be anything other than what she was. She saddled the gray mare, the smartest of their 3 horses, the one with the endurance for rough country. In her saddlebag she packed water-dried meat, a knife, and the small revolver Jacob had taught her to shoot. She also packed the turquoise piece, the coordinates, and the carved gun figure. The ride to the Red Hills took 2 hours, following game trails and dry creek beds that only someone who had lived here for years would know to follow. The land rose gradually, changing from flat desert scrub to rolling hills studded with juniper and pinon pine. The soil here was different, red and iron-rich, the color of blood mixed with earth. Jacob had always said the mining companies would come for this area eventually, that the geological surveys were only a matter of time, that they needed to be ready. She had not understood then what he meant by ready. Had thought he meant ready to defend, ready to fight. But now she wondered if he had meant something else entirely. Ready to reveal. Ready to use what was hidden as a weapon or a bargaining chip or a curse on those who came with greed instead of respect. The coordinates led her to a cluster of rocks that looked no different from 100 other formations in the area. But when she dismounted, tied the mare to a sturdy pine, and examined the rocks more closely, she saw the signs. Small cairns, Apache style, marking a path that would be invisible to anyone who did not know what to look for. Scratches on stone that might have been natural erosion, but were in fact directional markers. She followed the markers into a narrow defile between 2 rock faces, a space barely wide enough for a person to walk through sideways. The temperature dropped immediately, the sun blocked by the towering stones. Her boots crunched on loose gravel. The walls pressed close, and for a moment she felt the old fear, the trapped feeling she had carried since childhood, when the other Apache children would surround her, taunt her for her mixed blood, her lighter skin, her father, who had been a stranger passing through nothing more than a genetic accident. But she pushed through the fear, pushed through the narrow passage until it opened suddenly into a hidden canyon, a secret place that should not exist according to the maps she had studied of this area. The canyon was perhaps 200 feet across, sheltered on all sides by sheer rock walls. And in the center, hidden beneath a camouflage of brush and dead wood that had clearly been placed intentionally, was the entrance to a cave. Nylan approached slowly, every sense alert. This was the kind of place where spirits lived, where the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead grew thin. Her mother had taught her to recognize such places, to approach them with respect, to never take from them without offering something in return. She knelt at the cave entrance, pulled the turquoise piece from her pocket, and placed it on a flat rock. "I am Nalin, daughter of Se Da, daughter of the people who walked this land before the coming of the whites. I am also daughter of Jacob Thorne, who was given the task of protecting this place. I come seeking understanding, not desecration. I come seeking truth, not treasure." The words felt foolish as soon as she spoke them aloud, a superstition from a childhood she had tried to leave behind. But they also felt necessary, a bridge between the person she had been and the person she was becoming. She entered the cave. The interior was larger than she had expected, the ceiling high enough to stand the space extending back into darkness. But it was not completely dark. Shafts of light came through cracks in the rock above, illuminating the cave in strange, angular patterns. And everywhere, covering the walls, were Apache symbols. Not the simple pictographs that tourists might see in shallow caves near the settlements, but something older, more complex. These were prayer marks, protection symbols, the visual language of a people trying to preserve something precious against the inevitable crush of time and conquest. Nayland moved deeper into the cave, her eyes adjusting to the dimness. And then she saw it. Stacked against the far wall, protected by layers of hide and canvas, were objects she recognized from stories her mother had told. Apache weapons, yes, but not for war. These were ceremonial pieces, sacred objects that should have been buried with their owners or hidden in the mountain places where the tribe's spiritual power lived. Bows carved with prayer marks, arrows fletched with eagle feathers in patterns that represented specific clans, shields painted with images of the mountain spirits. This was not just a hiding place. This was a repository, a library of Apache culture that someone had decided to preserve against the day when it might otherwise be lost forever. And there in the center of it all was a journal. Not Jacob's journal, but older, written in Spanish and Apache and English, a trilingual testament to the complicated history of this land. Nayland picked it up with trembling hands, open to the first page. I am Tse Da, she who walks between waters, mother of Nayland. This record I make for my daughter, who will be born into a world that will not want her, a world that will try to make her choose between the blood of her mother and the blood of her father. I tell her this: you do not have to choose. You can be the living connection. You can be the living answer to the question that has no other answer. This place I entrust to Jacob Thorne, who has proven himself worthy not by strength but by witnessing pain and choosing compassion over orders. But the true guardian will be you, my daughter, when you are ready, when the time comes. The water below this mountain is sacred not because we made it so, but because it is so, because it has always been so, because the earth itself knows the difference between what is taken and what is shared. Jacob will hide this place from those who would desecrate it. But you, my daughter, you will reveal it when the moment demands revelation. Trust yourself, trust the land, trust that some things are worth more than survival. Some things are worth transformation. Nayland's vision blurred. She wiped her eyes impatiently, angry at herself for the weakness, angry at her mother for dying before she could explain any of this, angry at Jacob for carrying this secret alone, angry at the world for being exactly as cruel and complicated as it was. She sat down heavily on the cave floor, her back against the cool stone, and let herself feel it all. The grief for Daniel, the grief for Jacob, the grief for her mother, the grief for the person she had thought she was, the person who had believed she was nothing more than a woman trying to survive in a hard land. But she was more than that, had always been more than that. The blood in her veins was not a weakness, it was a weapon. It was a key. It was the exact thing that someone somewhere was going to fear most. She stayed in the cave for hours, reading her mother's journal, reading Jacob's notes that he had left there, notes he had clearly intended for her to find eventually. He had documented everything: meetings with Geronimo, conversations with Apache elders, the locations of sacred sites throughout the territory, and, most importantly, geological surveys that proved what the mining company suspected but could not confirm, that beneath this land ran one of the richest veins of turquoise in the entire Southwest, a deposit that would be worth millions if properly exploited. But more valuable than the turquoise was the water. Deep aquifers fed by snowmelt from mountains 50 miles away, water that traveled through underground channels in the exact pattern that Apache spiritual geography had mapped for centuries. The tribe had not known the scientific explanation, but they had known the truth that this place was a source, a beginning, a place where life came from. And Jacob had died protecting it, had been murdered protecting it, though she had never been able to prove it, had never been able to make anyone care enough to investigate properly. The sun was setting when Nayland finally emerged from the cave. She had made her decision. She would not run. She would not sell. She would not surrender what her mother and Jacob had died to protect. But she would also not hide anymore. She would not pretend to be less than she was. She would not bow her head to men who saw her as either a curiosity or an obstacle. She mounted the gray mare and began the ride back to the ranch, her mind already working through the implications, the strategies, the ways she could use law and custom, and the complicated rules of a society that wanted to ignore her existence. The ranch house lights were visible from a mile away, which was wrong. She had left no lamps burning, and there were too many horses tied at the fence, horses she did not recognize. Nalin slowed the mare to a walk, approached carefully. Through the window she could see figures moving inside her house. Men, at least 3 of them, and standing on her porch as if he owned it was a man she had seen only once before, 3 years ago at Jacob's funeral. Gabriel Carver. He was older than she remembered, his hair more gray than brown, now his face carved into harder lines by whatever years he had lived since that brief meeting. But his eyes were the same, sharp and calculating and carrying something that might have been regret or might have been something else entirely. He saw her approaching and raised one hand, not in threat, but in a gesture that might have been greeting or might have been warning. Hard to say with men like this, men who had learned to make their bodies into a language that could mean multiple things depending on who was reading. Nalin dismounted, left the mare's reins loose so the horse could flee if necessary. She walked toward the porch with her hands visible but ready, her body language communicating that she was not afraid, even though her heart was hammering against her ribs. "Mrs. Thorne," Carver said. His voice was rough, like a man who had spent too many years shouting orders or breathing dust or both. "I apologize for the intrusion. I would have waited for your return, but my business is urgent, and I was not sure when you would be back." "You could have waited outside," Nayland said. Her voice came out colder than she intended, but she did not soften it. "Breaking into a widow's home is not the act of a gentleman, Mr. Carver." "No," he agreed. "But I have not been a gentleman for a very long time." He gestured to the other men who filed out of the house with their hands conspicuously empty of weapons. "My associates were ensuring that you had not been the victim of theft or violence during your absence. This territory is not safe for women alone." "I am not alone," Nalin said. "I have my ranch hands, and I have the protection of knowing this land better than any man who thinks he can take what does not belong to him." Carver smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "Jacob used to say the same thing, word for word, actually. He taught you well." "What do you want, Mr. Carver?" He descended the porch steps, slowly stopped a respectful distance away, close enough to speak quietly, far enough that she could draw a weapon if needed. The careful distance of men who understood violence. "I want to talk about Fort Callahan," he said. "I want to talk about the Cibecue campaign. I want to talk about debts that cannot be paid and secrets that cannot be kept. But most of all, Mrs. Thorne, I want to talk about whether you understand exactly what Jacob died protecting and exactly how many people would kill to take it from you." Nylon kept her face neutral, but her mind was racing. Fort Callahan, the Cibecue campaign. These were things Jacob had mentioned only once in his sleep nightmares that had him wake up gasping, reaching for weapons that were not there. "I don't know what you mean," she said carefully. "Yes, you do." Carver's voice was gentle now, almost kind. "You have been to the Red Hills today. You have been to the place Jacob made sacred by hiding it. And now you know the truth, or at least part of it." "How did you know I went there?" "Because I would have done the same thing if I were you. Because Jacob told me years ago that if anything happened to him, you would eventually go searching. And because, Mrs. Thorne, I have been watching this ranch for 3 years, waiting for this exact moment." Nayland's hand moved toward her belt, where the revolver waited, but Carver raised both hands in a peaceful gesture. "I am not your enemy," he said, "though I understand why you would think otherwise. Let me tell you a story. Then you can decide whether to shoot me or hear what I came here to say." Against every instinct screaming at her to run, to fight, to do anything but stand here listening to a man who had violated her home. Nayland nodded once. Carver sat down on the porch steps, his body language deliberately non-threatening. 18 years ago, I was part of a cavalry unit sent to put down what the Army called an Apache uprising near Cibecue Creek. We were told the tribe was harboring murderers, planning raids on white settlements. We were given orders to pacify the situation by any means necessary. He paused, looked down at his hands, as if seeing something there that no one else could see. What we found was a village, mostly women and children, a few old men. Some warriors, yes, but not enough to be a threat to anyone. Our captain, a man named Reynolds, decided that pacification meant extermination. He gave the order to fire. Most of the men in my unit followed that order. Carver looked up, met her eyes. Jacob did not, and neither did I. We refused. We were arrested, court-martialed, dishonorably discharged. But before that, before the army could take us away, an old woman from the village came to us. She had been wounded, but not killed. She told us that she forgave us, but that forgiveness came with responsibility, that we had witnessed the breaking of something sacred, and now we had to protect what remained. My mother, Nellen said quietly. Yes, say da, she who walks between waters. She told us about this place, about the springs and the turquoise, and the sacred significance. She asked us to ensure it remained hidden until the time came when it could be revealed without triggering more violence. Jacob chose to do that by marrying you, by claiming the land legally, by becoming its guardian. I chose to do it by disappearing into the world that would eventually threaten this place, by becoming the kind of man who could gather intelligence, who could know when danger was coming. Nayland felt dizzy, the pieces rearranging themselves into a pattern that made terrible sense. You work for the mining company, she said. I work for several mining companies. I am what they call a fixer, someone who clears obstacles, who makes difficult situations simple. And I have spent 18 years making sure that every geological survey of this area was incomplete, every report inconclusive, every attempt to claim this land legally or illegally ran into complications. Until now. Until now, Carver agreed, because things have changed. The man who hired me most recently, Vernon Whitmore, is not a patient man, and he has access to resources I cannot match indefinitely. More importantly, his son died 6 months ago, his only heir, and in his grief he has become obsessed with building a legacy, with creating something that will outlast him. Carver paused, and something flickered across his face, almost like sympathy. Grief does strange things to men like him, makes them realize that empires built on theft crumble faster than those built on something real. But he doesn't know that yet. He's still trying to buy immortality with stolen land. He believes that controlling the water and mineral rights in this territory is how he will be remembered. And you are here to help him, Nayland said bitterly. No. Carver stood his movement slow and careful. I am here to help you. Because my own son died 3 months ago from a fever I could not afford to treat properly, and I no longer have any reason to play the role Whitmore hired me for. I am here because the debt I owe your mother, the debt Jacob and I both carried, is now yours to inherit. And I am here because what is about to happen will require more than one person to survive. He reached into his jacket, slowly pulled out a folded paper, and handed it to her. Nayland unfolded it. It was a legal document densely written bearing the seal of the Whitmore Mining Company. They plan to contest your ownership of this land, Carver said. They will claim that Jacob signed a preliminary agreement before his death that he intended to sell, but died before the transaction was complete. They will produce documents, witnesses, legal arguments that will tie you up in court for years, and while you are fighting them legally, they will make your life impossible in every other way. Accidents, thefts, fires. They will not burn your crops, Mrs. Thorne. They will burn your hope. Nayland read the document, her blood turning to ice. The signature at the bottom looked exactly like Jacob's handwriting, but she knew it was a forgery because Jacob would never have signed anything without telling her, without preparing her. This is fake, she said. Of course it is, but proving that will be difficult and expensive. Whitmore has lawyers who specialize in making forgeries look authentic, and the territorial courts are not known for their fairness to women, especially not women with Apache blood. Nayland looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. the same stars her mother had taught her to read as a child. She thought about Jacob, about Daniel, about all the ways she had tried to live quietly, to avoid notice, to survive by being invisible. But invisibility was no longer an option, had never truly been an option. "What do you suggest?" she asked. Carver smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. "I suggest we stop playing defense. I suggest we change the rules of the game entirely. And I suggest we do it in a way that honors the promise I made to your mother, the promise Jacob kept until his death." "And what promise is that?" "That this land will remain sacred, not by hiding what it is, but by revealing it in a way that makes it impossible to desecrate." Nylund turned to face him, fully saw in his weathered face something she recognized. The look of a man who had carried guilt for so long it had become part of his skeleton, part of the way he moved through the world. "Tell me everything," she said. And so he did. They talked through the night, Carver revealing the full extent of Whitmore's plans, the political connections, the legal strategies, the timeline for the assault on her land and her life. He told her about other homesteaders who had been forced out, about the methods the mining company used, about the men they employed to make problems disappear. But he also told her about weaknesses, about the ways that Whitmore's obsession made him predictable, about the resources Carver had accumulated over the years, the contacts, the leverage, the information that could be weaponized if used correctly. And slowly, as the night wore on and the stars wheeled overhead, Nayland began to see a path forward, not the path of violence that she had half expected, not the path of surrender that the world seemed to expect from her, but a third path, one that would require everything she had learned from being Apache, everything she had learned from being half-white, everything she had learned from Jacob and from her mother, and from the simple fact of surviving in a world that had never wanted her to exist. When dawn came, gray and cold, Carver stood to leave. "They will come soon," he said. "Within a week, I expect. Whitmore's lawyer, a man named Harrison Pinkerton. He will present the forged documents, make his case, give you a deadline to respond. Use that time wisely." "And what will you do?" Nayland asked. "I will continue to play my role. I will be the faithful employee, the man Whitmore trusts to handle difficult situations, but I will also be your eyes and ears inside his operation. And when the moment comes, I will make my choice clear." He paused at his horse, looked back at her. "Jacob used to say that you had your mother's gift for seeing what others could not see, for understanding that sometimes the weakest position is actually the strongest one if you know how to use it." I hope he was right. "So do I," Nayland said. She watched him ride away, watched the dawn light spread across the land that was hers and not hers, that belonged to her ancestors and to no one, that was worth killing for and worth dying for, and maybe, just maybe, worth transforming into something neither side of her heritage could have imagined alone. Inside the house, she found where Carver's men had searched the careful way they had looked through her things without destroying anything. They had been professionals, which was almost worse than amateurs would have been. Professionals knew what to look for, knew what mattered. But they had not found the hidden panel, had not found Jacob's journal or her mother's writings, had not found the maps or the coordinates or the small carved figure of the gone dancer. Nayland gathered these items, spread them out on the kitchen table. She added to them the forged document Carver had given her, the legal threat that was also an opportunity if she knew how to read it correctly. And then, for the first time since Daniel's death, she allowed herself to plan instead of mourn, to think strategically instead of emotionally, to become the person her mother had written about in that journal, the bridge between worlds, the living answer to an impossible question. She remembered what her mother had taught her about water and stone. Neither asks permission yet. Together they create canyons. Nayland would be both force and foundation, and it was time to let that truth carve its own path through the world, consequences be damned. She had 7 days before Whitmore's lawyer arrived. 7 days to prepare. 7 days to transform from a woman defending what she had inherited into something far more dangerous, a woman who understood exactly what she was and exactly what she could become. The sun rose fully, painting the desert in shades of gold and red, the colors of blood and treasure, of endings and beginnings. And Naline da Thorn stood in the doorway of her home, no longer a widow trying to survive, but a guardian preparing for war. Not the war anyone expected, but the war that needed to be fought. The war that her mother and Jacob had prepared her for without her even knowing. The war that would be won not with violence, but with revelation, not with surrender, but with transformation. The labyrinth was beginning to take shape, invisible still to those who would come with greed and certainty. But Naline could see its outlines already, could feel the pattern forming in her mind, ancient and new. Apache and something else entirely. Let them come, she thought. Let them all come. And let them discover what happens when they mistake a bridge for a barrier, when they mistake survival for weakness, when they mistake a woman straddling two bloodlines for someone who has no world at all. She was not caught. She had never been caught. She was the bridge itself. And bridges, when used correctly, could carry you across. Or they could collapse beneath you, sending you tumbling into the canyon below. The choice was not hers to make. The choice belonged to those who would try to cross. The 7 days passed like a held breath, each one stretched thin with preparation and the weight of what was coming. Naline moved through her ranch with the purposeful calm of someone who had finally stopped pretending to be smaller than she was. The ranch hands, Eli and Miguel, and the twins Jonas and Jeremiah noticed the change in her, even if they could not name it. She was no longer asking for their help. She was directing them with the quiet authority of someone who had accepted command not because she wanted it, but because it was already hers. On the third day, a rider came from Fort Grant. Not the lawyer yet, but a messenger bearing an envelope sealed with wax that bore the territorial seal. Naline opened it alone in her study, the room where Jacob had kept his books and his secrets, the room that smelled like old paper and tobacco, and the particular loneliness of a man trying to protect something too large for one person to carry. The letter was brief. Vernon Whitmore requested the honor of her presence at a hearing before the Territorial Land Commission to be held in 14 days at the courthouse in Silver City. The matter at hand disputed ownership of the property known as Thornwood Ranch Coordinates, provided legal description attached. Her attendance was not mandatory, but strongly encouraged in the interest of justice and due process. The language was polite, almost friendly, but Naline could read the threat underneath like reading tracks in sand. They were not asking. They were informing her that the machinery of law had already begun to move, that she was now caught in gears that would grind slowly but inevitably unless she found a way to jam them. She burned the letter in the fireplace, watched the paper curl and blacken and turn to ash. Then she saddled her horse and rode to the place she had been avoiding for 3 days, the place she knew she needed to go, but had been putting off because of what it would mean. The San Carlos Reservation was a day's hard ride north. Naline had not been there since her mother's death 15 years ago, had not wanted to return to the place where she had learned so clearly that being half of something meant you were fully nothing, that the Apache would never accept her as truly theirs, any more than the whites would accept her as truly theirs. But things had changed. She had changed, and more importantly, she was no longer trying to be accepted. She was trying to survive, and survival sometimes meant returning to the places that had rejected you and asking for help anyway. The reservation was worse than she remembered. The land the government had given the Apache was dry and hostile, even by desert standards, the kind of place that punished any attempt at agriculture or cattle ranching. The people she passed looked thin, their eyes carrying the particular exhaustion of those who had been defeated not in one battle, but in 1,000 small ways day after day, until defeat became simply the texture of existence. She asked for the council house, was directed to a low building made of adobe and government-issue lumber that did not quite fit together properly. Inside, 3 old men sat in the dim coolness, their faces mapping every hard year they had lived. One of them recognized her. She saw it in the way his eyes narrowed, the way his mouth tightened. "You are Tse Da's daughter," he said in Apache, "the one who married the white soldier." "I am," Nalin replied in the same language, feeling the words strange in her mouth after so many years of speaking mostly English. "I have come to ask for counsel." "The half-blood comes to the reservation seeking wisdom," another elder said, and there was bitterness in his voice, but also something else. Curiosity, perhaps. "What wisdom do we have that the white world has not already taught you?" Nalin did not flinch from his tone. "My mother entrusted something to my husband and me, a sacred place, the place where the water rises and the stone remembers. Now the white mining companies want to take it. I need to know if protecting that place is worth what it will cost." The 3 elders exchanged glances, a whole conversation happening in the space between heartbeats. "Sit," the first elder said. She sat on the packed earth floor waiting. The silence stretched long enough that she wondered if they would speak at all if they had called her to sit only to teach her what it felt like to be dismissed. But finally the oldest of them, a man whose face looked like weathered stone, spoke. "Your mother was our holy woman. She saw things others could not see. When the soldiers came to Sibiku, she knew they would come. She knew what they would do. She sent most of the children away before the shooting started. She saved many lives. But she stayed herself because someone needed to remember what happened there, needed to bear witness." He paused, his eyes distant with memory. "Before she died from her wounds, she told us about 2 white soldiers who had refused to kill. She said they were different from the others, that they carried shame like weight, that they could be trusted with certain truths. We did not believe her. We thought she was speaking from fever dreams, but she insisted, said that the old world was dying, that we could die with it, or we could plant seeds for a new world that we would not live to see." The second elder took up the story. "She told us about the springs, the place we have always known was sacred, the place where the boundaries between this world and the spirit world grow thin. She said it would be the last place, the last piece of land we could protect. But it could not be protected in the old way by warriors and weapons. It had to be protected by something the whites would understand. Law, ownership, the paper magic they used to divide the earth." "So you let her give it to my husband," Nalin said. "We let her give it to you," the third elder corrected. "Your husband was only the legal vessel. You were always the true guardian, half Apache, half white, belonging fully to neither. You were the perfect choice for a place that needed to belong to everyone and no one." Nalin felt something shift inside her chest, a weight she had carried for so long she had forgotten it was there. You knew what she was doing. You let me grow up thinking I was rejected, thinking I was not wanted." The first elder's face softened slightly. "We let you grow up free from the burden of knowing you were chosen, free to become strong in your own way without the weight of expectation. Your mother was wise. She knew that a guardian who thinks she is rejected will be harder to corrupt than a guardian who thinks she is special." Nalin closed her eyes, felt tears pressing against her eyelids, but refused to let them fall. All those years, all that pain. And it had been intentional, not cruelty, but strategy. Her mother had loved her enough to let her be wounded so that she could become strong in the wounded places. "Tell me what I need to know," she said quietly. And so they told her. About the geological reality beneath the spiritual truth, about the aquifers that fed half the territory, about the turquoise deposits that were valuable but not nearly as valuable as the water, about the legal precedents that might protect the land and the ones that would certainly condemn it, about the political landscape which officials could be trusted and which were already bought by mining interests. But most importantly, they told her about something she had not known, something that changed everything. "There are others," the first elder said, "not just Apache. The Chinese who work the railroads, many of them have been forced off their camps, have nowhere to go. The Mexicans who lost their land grants to American lawyers who declared their deeds invalid. Even some whites, those who ran from the war, those who could not fit into the new order, all of them are looking for a place that the law has not yet reached, a place that exists between the cracks of empires. "You want me to make Thornwood that place," Nayland said. "We want you to make it what it has always been meant to be, a sanctuary. Not just for one people, but for all the peoples who do not fit, the ones who are too mixed, too broken, too inconvenient for the world that is being built around us." Nayland rode back to Thornwood with her mind spinning, seeing possibilities she had not imagined before. Carver's plan had been defensive, focused on using legal maneuvering to delay and obstruct Whitmore's takeover. But the elders had shown her something different. Not defense, but transformation. Not preserving what was, but creating what could be. When she arrived at the ranch after dark, exhausted and windburned from the long ride, she found Eli waiting on the porch with news that made her forget her fatigue. "Miss Nayland, we got trouble. That Chinese girl Mina, the one you took in last year. I caught her sending letters through the Fort Grant post." "Been doing it for months, looks like." Nayland's stomach dropped. "Letters to who?" "Don't know exactly, but I saw the address before she grabbed it away. Something called the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association. San Francisco." Nayland found Mina in the small room off the kitchen where she slept, packing her few belongings into a cloth bag with shaking hands. The young woman looked up when Nayland entered, her face a mask of fear and defiance mixed together. "I can explain," Mina said in the careful English she had worked so hard to perfect. "Then explain." Nayland closed the door behind her, kept her voice level. "Explain why you have been sending information about my property to an organization in California." Mina's hands stilled on the bag. For a long moment she said nothing, and Nayland could see her weighing her options, trying to decide if the truth would save her or condemn her. Finally she spoke. "You saved my life 2 years ago. When those men were hunting me, when they would have sold me back to the railroad company or worse. You did not ask why I was running or what I had done. You just gave me a place to sleep and work to do and asked nothing in return. And you repaid me by spying." "No." Mina's voice cracked. "I repaid you by trying to save you the only way I knew how. The Benevolent Association. They help Chinese people buy land, start businesses, protect each other from the laws that try to push us out. I sent them information about the water here, about the soil, about how this place could support farming and settlement. I told them that if they could buy this land before the mining company, they could turn it into a safe place for our people." Nayland sat down heavily on the narrow bed. "You were trying to buy my land out from under me. I was trying to keep it from being destroyed by men who only see profit." Mina's eyes filled with tears. "I thought if Chinese investors owned it, they would at least preserve it, would treat it with respect. I did not know about your mother. I did not know about the sacred places. I only knew that you were one woman alone against forces too large to fight. You should have asked me. Would you have listened?" Mina wiped her eyes roughly. "You are Apache and white. I am Chinese. We both live in the margins, though our margins are shaped differently. I thought you would not trust me with the truth." Nayland stared at this young woman who she had saved and fed and taught and never quite seen as an equal, never quite trusted with the full truth of her situation. And she saw in Mina the same thing she saw in herself, someone trying to protect their people in a world that made protection nearly impossible. "Tell me about your father," Nayland said suddenly. Mina looked startled. "What? Your father? You told me once he was an engineer in China. Tell me about him." "He designed bridges," Mina said slowly, "for the emperor's roads. He taught me to read technical drawings to understand how weight and force and materials all work together to create something that can bear burdens it should not be able to bear." "Bridges," Nayland repeated. "Not walls. Bridges." "Yes. He used to say that a bridge was the most honest structure because it admits it cannot stand alone, that it needs both sides, that its strength comes from connection rather than isolation." Nyland stood moved to the window, looked out at the dark shapes of the ranch buildings against the starlit sky. "I am going to tell you something, Mina, and then you are going to decide whether you want to stay and help me or whether you want to leave and never come back." She told her everything, about her mother and Jacob and Carver, about the sacred springs and the turquoise and the water rights, about Whitmore's plans and the forged documents and the hearing in Silver City, and about the new plan that was forming in her mind, the one that was larger and stranger and more dangerous than anything she had imagined before. When she finished, Mina was silent for a long time. "You want to turn this place into something that has never existed before," she finally said. "Not a reservation, not a white settlement, not a Chinese camp, something else." "Yes. They will fight you, all of them. The government, the mining companies, even some of your own people." "I know. You might lose everything." "I have already lost everything that can be taken from me by force," Nyland said. "The only thing I have left is the choice of what I do with what remains." Mina smiled, and it was the first genuine smile Nalin had ever seen on her face. "My father also used to say that the most dangerous bridge is the one that has never been built before, because you cannot know if it will hold until people actually walk across it." "Will you help me build it?" "Yes." Mina unfolded the technical drawings she had been working on, the ones that mapped the water system beneath Thornwood with a precision that combined Apache traditional knowledge and Chinese engineering principles. "And I think I know how to make it strong enough to hold." Over the next week, Nyland assembled what she had begun to think of as her council. Not a council of elders or chiefs or landowners, but something new. Eli, her foreman, who represented the white settlers who had chosen to work with her rather than against her. Miguel, who had fled north from Mexico with his knowledge of explosives and mining, who represented all those who had lost their land to American expansion. The twins Jonas and Jeremiah, sharpshooters with their own reasons for living on the margins of society. And now Mina, representing the Chinese workers who had built the railroads and been cast aside. And on the seventh day after receiving the letter, Gabriel Carver returned. He came alone this time at dusk, and Nyland met him at the edge of the property rather than making him come to the house. She wanted this conversation to happen in the liminal space, the between place where decisions that would shape everything were made. "Pinkerton arrives tomorrow," Carver said without preamble. "He will present the forged documents and give you 1 week to contest them or accept Whitmore's offer to buy you out for a fraction of what the land is worth." "I will do neither," Nyland said. Carver's eyebrows rose. "You have found a third option. I have found the only option that makes any sense, but it requires something from you that you may not be willing to give." "Tell me." Nyland took a breath, felt the weight of what she was about to ask. "You have spent 18 years pretending to work for the people you actually oppose. You have been a spy in their camp, feeding them false information, delaying their plans. But you have done it by making yourself complicit in their smaller crimes, by being the kind of man who can be trusted to do terrible things." "Yes," Carver said quietly. "That is an accurate description of what I have become. I need you to stop pretending. I need you to make a choice publicly in front of witnesses who will report it to everyone who matters. And that choice will likely destroy whatever life you have built, whatever reputation you have maintained." Carver was silent, staring out at the darkening horizon, where the last light was fading from gold to purple to the deep blue of approaching night. "My son died because I did not have enough money to get him to a doctor who could save him," he finally said. "I was too busy being reliable, being useful to Whitmore, maintaining my cover. I told myself I was doing important work protecting this sacred place. But the truth is, I was protecting my own cowardice. It was easier to be a secret guardian than to be an open enemy." He turned to look at her directly. "What you are asking would be a relief, a terrible, frightening relief. To finally stop lying, to finally be honest about what I believe and who I serve." "It will not bring your son back," Nyland said gently. "No, but it might make his death mean something other than my failure. Tell me what you need." Nalin explained her plan, and as she spoke she saw Carver's expression change from surprise to understanding to something that looked almost like hope. "It is ambitious," he said when she finished. "It requires perfect timing and absolute trust and a great deal of luck. Yes. And if it fails, we will both lose everything we have left." "We have already lost everything that matters," Nayland said. "Now we are just deciding what we do with the wreckage." Carver extended his hand not in the formal way of a business agreement, but in the way of soldiers pledging themselves to a dangerous mission. "Then let us make something worth remembering from the ruins." Nalin took his hand, felt the calluses and scars, the physical record of a life spent in violence and deception. But she also felt the strength there, the determination of someone who had finally found a cause worth being honest about. Harrison Pinkerton arrived at noon the next day in a carriage that was too fine for the rough roads leading to Thornwood, driven by a man who clearly wished he was anywhere else. Pinkerton himself was exactly what Nalin had expected, well-dressed, well-spoken, carrying himself with the casual confidence of someone who had won 100 legal battles and expected to win 100 more. He declined her offer of coffee, declined her offer to sit in the shade of the porch, clearly wanting to conduct his business quickly and leave this uncomfortable place behind. "Mrs. Thorne," he began, pulling documents from his leather case. "I represent the interests of Whitmore Mining Company in a matter concerning the ownership of the property known as Thornwood Ranch. It has come to our attention that your late husband, Jacob Thorne, entered into a preliminary agreement with our client shortly before his unfortunate death." He spread the papers on the porch railing, pointed to the signature that looked so much like Jacob's that Nayland felt a chill despite the heat. "As you can see, Mr. Thorne agreed to sell the mineral and water rights to this property for a sum of $10,000, with the transaction to be completed within 1 year of the agreement date. That date has now passed, but Whitmore Mining is prepared to honor the original terms as a gesture of goodwill toward his widow." "That is generous," Nayland said, her voice neutral. "We think so. Of course, if you contest the validity of this agreement, the matter will need to be settled in court, which could take years and cost a great deal in legal fees. And in the meantime, the property would likely be placed in receivership, meaning you would lose access to it until the matter is resolved." "Also generous," Nayland said, "to give me the choice between losing everything slowly or losing everything quickly." Pinkerton's smile tightened. "I understand this is difficult, Mrs. Thorne, but the law is quite clear. A contract is a contract, and your husband's signature is valid. Even if that signature is a forgery, can you prove it is a forgery? Can you prove it is not?" They stared at each other, two people playing a game where the rules had been written by men who never intended for women like Nayland to even sit at the table. "I will give you 1 week to consider our offer," Pinkerton said finally. "After that, we will proceed with legal action to enforce the contract. I strongly suggest you use that time to consult with an attorney, though I should warn you that most lawyers in this territory are reluctant to take cases against Whitmore Mining." "I am sure they are," Nayland said. "Mr. Pinkerton, before you go, I would like to show you something. It will only take a moment." Pinkerton looked annoyed, but curious. "Very well." Nalin led him not into the house, but toward the eastern boundary of the property, where the land began to rise toward the red hills. Carver was waiting there as planned, along with Eli and Miguel and the others, and there, standing in a loose semicircle, were 20 more people. Nayland had sent word through channels she barely understood, messages carried by people who existed in the spaces between official recognition. Apache from the reservation, dressed in a mixture of traditional and modern clothing. Chinese men who had escaped from railroad camps, their faces scarred from hard labor and harder treatment. Mexican families who had lost their land grants to American lawyers, and a handful of white settlers who had been pushed out of other territories for being too sympathetic to the wrong causes. Pinkerton stopped walking, his face going pale, as he realized he was suddenly outnumbered by people who had no reason to respect his authority or his paperwork. "What is this?" he demanded. "This," Nayland said calmly, "is the true council of Thornwood. These are the people who have been living and working on this land, who have been helping me maintain it, who have built their homes here with my permission and my blessing. Under territorial homestead law, I have the right to designate portions of my land for settlement by others, which I have done. These people are now legal residents with claims that supersede any prior contracts." It was not entirely true, not yet, but it sounded official enough to make Pinkerton uncertain. "Furthermore," Nayland continued, "I have today filed papers with the territorial government requesting that Thornwood be designated as a trust territory governed by a council of residents rather than a single owner. This is legal under an obscure provision of the Homestead Act that allows for communal settlement in regions where individual ownership has proven untenable." This part was true. Mina had found the legal provision buried in documents from the 1860s, a brief window when the government had been experimenting with different settlement models before deciding that individual ownership was the only American way. Pinkerton recovered his composure, though his voice was harder now. "Even if such a designation were possible, which I doubt, it would not invalidate the contract your husband signed." "Then I suppose we will let the courts decide," Nayland said. "But I should warn you, Mr. Pinkerton, that I have evidence which will be entered into the court record, evidence that may be embarrassing to your client." She gestured, and Carver stepped forward holding a wooden box. "This box contains correspondence between Vernon Whitmore and several territorial officials discussing methods to force homesteaders off their land through legal intimidation and selective enforcement of regulations. It also contains geological surveys that prove Whitmore has known about the resources beneath Thornwood for at least 5 years, during which time he has been systematically trying to acquire it through fraud and coercion." Pinkerton's eyes widened. "Where did you get those documents?" "From someone who knows that loyalty to a liar is not loyalty at all," Carver said quietly. "From someone who is tired of pretending that what we are doing is legal or moral or anything other than theft dressed up in contracts." Pinkerton looked at Carver with the dawning realization of betrayal. "You work for Whitmore." "I did," Carver agreed. "But I have decided that 18 years of working for men like him is enough. I am now working for Mrs. Thorne, or rather I am working for the idea that this land should belong to the people who respect it rather than the people who want to bleed it dry." For a long moment, no one spoke. The wind moved through the juniper trees, carrying the scent of sage and dust, and the peculiar electricity of a moment when everything could tip either toward violence or toward something else entirely. Pinkerton carefully gathered his papers, returned them to his case. When he spoke, his voice was still professional, but there was an edge of respect that had not been there before. "You have made this significantly more complicated, Mrs. Thorne. I will relay your position to Mr. Whitmore, but I should warn you that he is not a man who accepts complications gracefully." "Neither am I," Nayland said. After Pinkerton had left, the gathered council remained waiting to see what would happen next. Nayland stood before them, feeling the weight of all those eyes, all those expectations, all those hopes that she was suddenly responsible for carrying. "I cannot promise this will work," she said in English, then repeated in Spanish and Apache, with Mina translating quietly into Cantonese for those who needed it. "I cannot promise we will win in court or that the government will accept our claim. I cannot promise that Whitmore will not find other ways to attack us. All I can promise is that we will fight together, that we will protect each other, and that whatever happens, this place will stand as proof that people from different worlds can build something new together." One of the Apache elders, an old man who had come from San Carlos against the orders of the reservation agent, spoke up. "In the old days, when we needed to protect something sacred, we would perform a ceremony, bind ourselves to the place and to each other with oaths that could not be broken. Perhaps we need something like that now." "I do not know the proper ceremonies," Nayland admitted. I was never taught them." "Then we will teach you," the elder said. "And we will adapt them, because this is a new thing we are protecting. Not just an Apache sacred place, but a place that belongs to all of us." And so, as the sun set over Thornwood, something unprecedented happened. The Apache elder led a ceremony that combined traditional elements with improvised additions, creating a ritual that had never existed before, because it had never needed to exist before. Each person present contributed something, a prayer in their own language, a gesture from their own tradition, a promise made in their own way. Nyland stood at the center of it, feeling the power of communal intention, feeling the way that separate individuals could become something larger when they chose to bind themselves together toward a common purpose. When it was done, when the last words had been spoken and the ceremonial fire had burned down to embers, Carver approached her quietly. "You know this is only the beginning," he said. "Whitmore will not accept this. He will come at us with everything he has." "I know," Nayland said. "But he will not be fighting just me anymore. He will be fighting an idea, and ideas are harder to kill than people." "Not always," Carver said darkly. "I have seen plenty of ideas die. So have I, but I have also seen them survive in ways their enemies never expected." She looked at him directly. "You asked me once if I understood what Jacob died protecting. I do now. He was not protecting land or water or even Apache sacred places. He was protecting the possibility that different people could live together without one group dominating the others. That is what we are building here. That is what Whitmore fears most." That night, Nayland returned to the cave in the Red Hills one more time alone. She needed to speak to her mother, or to the memory of her mother, or to whatever spirits guarded places where the boundaries grew thin. She lit a small fire, sat cross-legged in front of it, and spoke aloud the things she had never said when her mother was alive. "You made me a bridge, and I hated you for it. You let me be rejected so I would be strong, and I hated you for that too. But I understand now. You could not tell me what I was because I had to discover it myself, had to earn it through suffering and survival. You gave me the hardest gift, the gift of not belonging anywhere, so that I could belong everywhere." The fire crackled, throwing shadows on the cave walls where centuries of prayers had been painted. "I do not know if what I am building will survive, but I know that it is worth building, that it is the only thing worth building. And I know that you and Jacob and everyone who sacrificed to protect this place would understand what I am trying to do." Nayland added more wood to the fire, watched the flames grow, felt their heat on her face. "They are coming for us, Mother. Whitmore and his lawyers, and all the weight of a system that believes land belongs to whoever can take it and hold it. But we have something they do not have. We have each other. We have the knowledge that this fight is not about ownership, it is about stewardship. And we have the willingness to become something new, something that has never existed before." She stayed in the cave until dawn, and when she emerged, the sun was rising over a landscape that looked both ancient and impossibly young, both unchanged and transformed by the simple fact of people choosing to see it differently, to treat it differently, to become different themselves in relation to it. Nayland rode back to Thornwood with her mind clear and her purpose settled. The hearing in Silver City was 1 week away. Whatever happened there would determine the immediate future of everything she was trying to build. But in a deeper sense, the hearing did not matter at all. Because the real work was not about winning in court. It was about creating something so strong, so deeply rooted in shared purpose, that it could survive whatever the law decided to do. She had 7 days to make that vision real enough, solid enough, undeniable enough that even defeat could not truly destroy it. 7 days to transform Thornwood from a ranch into a living argument from private property, into sacred trust, from one woman's desperate defense, into a demonstration that the world did not have to be organized the way powerful men insisted it must be organized. 7 days to build a bridge that had never been built before, and pray that it would hold when tested. The pattern was taking shape through relationships forged across boundaries, through promises made in multiple languages, through the daily choice to trust, despite every reason not to. And at the center of it all stood Nalin, no longer a widow, defending what she had lost, but a guardian, protecting what was still becoming. What would continue becoming long after she was gone, what would live in the choices of all those who came after and decided that the bridge was worth crossing, worth maintaining, worth dying for, if necessary. When Whitmore arrived with his lawyers and certainty, when the territorial government came with regulations designed to crush imagination, they would discover something unexpected, not a vulnerable woman awaiting defeat, but a community that had already claimed victory through the revolutionary act of existing together. What they called impossible was already real breathing, growing stronger with each shared meal and collective decision. And that belief that shared commitment was more dangerous to Whitmore's world than any weapon could ever be, because it proved that his world was not inevitable, not natural, not the only way things could be. It proved that even in defeat, even in destruction, they had created something that could not be entirely erased. A memory, a possibility, a ghost of the future haunting the present, whispering that other worlds were possible, that bridges could be built, that the labyrinth was not a trap, but a path. And sometimes the path was enough. The hearing room in Silver City was smaller than Nalin had expected, which somehow made it more intimidating rather than less. The walls were bare wood, stained dark with age and tobacco smoke, and the windows were positioned high enough that you could not see out, could not be distracted by the world beyond this enclosed space, where men in formal clothes decided the fate of land they had never walked on water. They had never tasted people they would never meet. Nalin sat at a table that was too large for her, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. Behind her, in the gallery, meant for observers, sat her assembled council. Carver was there, cleaned up and dressed like a respectable businessman, his face carefully neutral. Eli and Miguel flanked him, their discomfort with indoor spaces and formal proceedings visible in the way they held their bodies, too still, too controlled. Mina sat with perfect posture, her face unreadable. A notebook open in her lap where she was recording everything in the precise handwriting she had learned from her engineer father, and scattered throughout the remaining seats were the others, Apache elders who had traveled from San Carlos despite the risk of leaving the reservation without permission, Chinese men who had nothing to lose because everything had already been taken from them, Mexican families whose presence here was itself an act of defiance against a system that pretended they no longer existed. At the opposing table sat Harrison Pinkerton, impeccable in his tailored suit, flanked by two assistants who carried enough leather document cases to stock a small library. Behind him, in the first row of the gallery, sat a man Nalin recognized from descriptions, though she had never seen him in person. Vernon Whitmore himself, 62 years old, and radiating the particular arrogance of someone who had spent his entire life getting what he wanted through money and patience and the strategic application of legal violence. The territorial commissioner who would adjudicate the hearing was a man named Augustus Thornhill, appointed by the governor and known for his strict interpretation of property law. He entered from a side door, his black robes making him look like a carrion bird, and everyone rose in the automatic deference to authority that civilization demanded. "Be seated," Thornhill said, arranging papers on his elevated desk. "This is a hearing to determine the validity of a contract dispute regarding the property known as Thornwood Ranch, currently held by Mrs. Nalin Thorne, widow of Jacob Thorne, deceased. Mr. Pinkerton, you represent the claimant. Please state your case." Pinkerton rose with the smooth confidence of someone who had performed this ritual 100 times. "Thank you, Commissioner. The matter is quite straightforward. My client, Whitmore Mining Company, entered into a binding agreement with Jacob Thorne on March 15, 1873, for the purchase of mineral and water rights to the property in question. Mr. Thorne accepted payment of $1,000 as a deposit, with the remaining $9,000 to be paid upon completion of the transaction within 1 year. He placed a document on Thornhill's desk. This is the original contract bearing Mr. Thorne's signature, witnessed by 2 individuals whose depositions I have also provided. Mr. Thorne died before the transaction could be completed, but under territorial law, contracts survive the death of the signer and are binding upon their heirs. Mrs. Thorne, as the sole heir, is therefore obligated to honor her husband's agreement. Thornhill examined the document, his face revealing nothing. Mrs. Thorne, do you contest the validity of this contract? Nolin stood feeling her legs steady beneath her, despite the churning in her stomach. I do, Commissioner. That signature is a forgery. My husband would never have agreed to sell the water rights to our land, and he certainly would not have done so without informing me. Can you prove the signature is forged? Thornhill asked. Can Mr. Pinkerton prove it is authentic? Nayland countered. Thornhill's mouth tightened. That is not how the law works, Mrs. Thorne. The burden of proof lies with the person contesting the contract, not the person presenting it. Then the law is designed to favor those with the resources to create convincing forgeries, Nolin said, keeping her voice level. Commissioner, I would like to enter into evidence a pattern of behavior by Whitmore Mining Company that demonstrates a systematic campaign to acquire properties through fraudulent means. She gestured to Carver, who came forward with the wooden box he had shown Pinkerton a week earlier. Inside were the documents he had gathered over 18 years of working inside the mining company's operations correspondence that revealed the calculated strategy of identifying valuable properties, targeting vulnerable owners, and using forged contracts, intimidation, and selective legal enforcement to force sales. Pinkerton was on his feet immediately. Commissioner, I object. The provenance of these documents is unknown. They could be forgeries themselves, and even if authentic, they have no bearing on the specific contract in question. They establish a pattern, Nayland argued. A pattern that makes it reasonable to question whether the contract Mr. Pinkerton is presenting is genuine. Thornhill examined several of the documents Carver had provided, his expression growing more troubled as he read. Mr. Pinkerton, some of these letters appear to be signed by your client. Can you authenticate them? Without examining the originals in detail, I cannot speak to their authenticity, Pinkerton said smoothly. But even if they are genuine correspondence about other properties does not invalidate the contract regarding Thornwood Ranch. It does if it shows that my client habitually engages in fraud, Carver said, speaking for the first time. His voice was quiet, but carried weight, the authority of someone who knew exactly what he was talking about because he had participated in it. Commissioner, my name is Gabriel Carver. For 18 years I have worked for Whitmore Mining in various capacities. I have personal knowledge that the contract being presented today was created using a signature sample obtained from a letter Jacob Thorne wrote to a supplier in 1872. I know this because I provided that letter to the forger who created the contract. The room erupted. Whitmore was on his feet, face purple with rage. Pinkerton was shouting objections. The observers in the gallery were talking over each other in multiple languages, creating a chaos of sound that Thornhill had to gavel into silence. Order, Thornhill barked. Mr. Carver, you are confessing to participation in fraud. I am, Carver said calmly, and I am prepared to face whatever legal consequences that confession entails. But I am also prepared to testify under oath about every fraudulent contract I helped create, every property that was stolen through legal manipulation, every official who was bribed to look the other way. This man is clearly lying to curry favor with Mrs. Thorne, Pinkerton said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. He has no credibility. On the contrary, Carver said, I have perfect credibility on this specific subject. Who better to testify about fraud than someone who committed it? Thornhill leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable. This is highly irregular. I will need to take testimony from both parties, examine the evidence, and consult with legal precedents before making any determination. This hearing is adjourned until tomorrow morning, at which time I will hear detailed testimony from Mr. Carver and anyone else with relevant knowledge. As the room cleared, Nayland felt a hand on her elbow. She turned to find Whitmore himself, his face composed now, the rage hidden beneath a mask of cold calculation. "Mrs. Thorne," he said quietly, "I believe we may have gotten off on the wrong foot. Perhaps we could speak privately about a resolution that does not require destroying Mr. Carver's reputation or prolonging these unpleasant proceedings." "I have nothing to say to you in private," Nayland replied. "Not even if I told you that I am prepared to offer you a partnership rather than a buyout, that I recognize the value of having someone with your unique background and connections as an ally rather than an adversary." Nayland studied his face, saw the calculation there, the way he was already adjusting his strategy, looking for a new angle of attack. "You want to make me complicit, to give me just enough stake that I will have to defend your interests as well as my own." "I want to make you wealthy," Whitmore corrected. "I want to make us both wealthy. The water and minerals beneath your land are worth more than you can imagine. Why should either of us fight over it when we could profit together?" "Because profit is not what that land is for," Nayland said, "and because men like you do not understand that some things have value beyond what they can be sold for." Whitmore's expression hardened. "Then you are a fool, Mrs. Thorne, and I do not do business with fools." He walked away, and Nayland felt Carver move to her side. "He will come at us harder now," Carver said. "That was his attempt at a peaceful resolution. When we refused, we made this personal for him." "It was always personal," Nayland said. "He just did not realize it until now." That night Nayland could not sleep. She lay in the hotel room the council had pooled their resources to rent, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a town at night and thinking about what tomorrow would bring. Carver's testimony would damage Whitmore's case, but it would not destroy it. The commissioner would still have to weigh testimony against documentation, one man's word against what appeared to be legitimate contracts and witnesses. She rose, dressed quietly, and slipped out of the hotel into the pre-dawn darkness. Silver City was quiet at this hour, just a few late-night drinkers staggering home from the saloons, a night watchman making his rounds with a lantern that cast moving shadows on the wooden storefronts. Nayland walked to the edge of town, to the place where buildings gave way to open land, and stood looking east toward where Thornwood waited, invisible in the darkness, but present in her mind like a compass point, like the center around which everything else revolved. Her mother's face came to her, that last moment at Sibicu, when dying became deliberate, a planting of seeds for futures she would never witness. Then Jacob, 15 years carrying an impossible promise, believing some things outweighed survival itself. And Daniel, forever 12, his unfinished life, the cost of men who measured worth only in dollars and extraction rights. And she thought about all the others, all the people who had come to Thornwood because they had nowhere else to go, because they were caught between worlds just like her, because they needed to believe that being broken into pieces by history did not mean you could not be whole in a new way. "You cannot sleep either." Nayland turned to find Mina approaching, wrapped in a shawl against the desert cold. "Too much weighing on my mind," Nayland admitted. "Mine as well." Mina stood beside her, both of them looking east. "I have been thinking about my father, about what he would say if he could see what we are trying to do." What would he say? He would say that the most dangerous moment for a bridge is not when it is being built, but when it is being tested for the first time, when people walk across it not knowing if it will hold their weight. Mina paused. He would also say that you cannot know if a bridge is strong enough until you actually test it. That is what tomorrow is, the test. And if we fail, then we fail knowing we tried to build something worth building. That is more than most people can say. Mina smiled slightly. "Besides, my father also taught me that when a bridge fails, you learn more about engineering than when it succeeds. Failure is information. It tells you what to do differently next time." "I do not want there to be a next time," Nayland said. "I want this to be the time that works." "Then we make it work." We walk across that bridge tomorrow with all the courage we can carry, and we trust that it was built well enough to hold us." They stood together in the darkness, two women who should have been enemies, according to the logic of a world that divided people into neat categories, but who had instead become allies, become sisters, become proof that the categories were lies. When dawn came, Nayland returned to the hearing room with her counsel around her, and she felt their presence like armor, like a shield that was not made of metal, but of shared purpose, of collective determination, that this place they had begun to build together would not be taken without a fight that revealed everything ugly about the taking. Commissioner Thornhill opened the second day of proceedings with an announcement that sent a chill through Naline's spine. "I have reviewed the evidence presented yesterday, and I have concluded that the contract presented by Whitmore Mining appears to be authentic, based on signature analysis and witness testimony. However, I am troubled by Mr. Carver's allegations of a pattern of fraud. Therefore, I am ordering a full investigation into Whitmore Mining's business practices over the past 2 decades. He paused, looking directly at Nayland. "However, Mrs. Thorne, such an investigation will take months, possibly years. In the meantime, I cannot simply void a contract that appears legitimate on its face. Therefore, I am ruling that Whitmore Mining has a valid claim to the mineral and water rights specified in the contract pending the outcome of the fraud investigation." Nayland felt the room tilt. Behind her she heard gasps, angry muttering in multiple languages, the sound of hopes crashing against the immovable wall of legal procedure, but Thornhill was not finished. "However, I am also troubled by the evidence Mrs. Thorne has presented regarding the cultural and spiritual significance of the property in question. Therefore, I am ordering that any mining or water extraction operations be delayed until the territorial government can conduct a proper assessment of the archaeological and cultural resources on the property." It was a split decision, giving something to both sides while satisfying neither. Classic legal compromise that preserved the system while pretending to serve justice. Pinkerton stood immediately. "Commissioner, my client has already waited 3 years for this matter to be resolved. Further delays are unacceptable." "Your client can file an appeal if he wishes," Thornhill said, "but my ruling stands. This hearing is adjourned." In the chaos that followed as people filed out arguing and gesturing and trying to understand what had just happened, Nayland remained seated, her mind racing. The ruling was not a victory, but it was not total defeat either. She had bought time, perhaps 6 months, perhaps a year before Whitmore could begin extracting resources from Thornwood. But time for what? Time to mount a legal defense she could not afford. Time to watch the investigation drag on while lawyers got rich and nothing changed. Time to prepare for the inevitable moment when the cultural assessment would conclude that whatever Apache artifacts existed on the property were interesting but not significant enough to prevent development. She felt Carver's hand on her shoulder. "It is not over." "It is not a beginning either," Nayland said. "We are in limbo, suspended between victory and defeat." Then we use the suspension. We use the time we have been given to make Thornwood so valuable as what it is so important to so many people that taking it becomes politically impossible even if it remains legally permissible. Nayland looked up at him. "You mean we build the trust territory anyway? We proceed as if we had won." "Exactly. We make it real before they can stop us from making it real. We demonstrate the possibility so clearly that people cannot unsee it." Mina appeared beside them, her notebook clutched against her chest. "I have been calculating. If we pool all our resources, we have enough to purchase equipment for small-scale turquoise mining. Not industrial extraction, but traditional Apache methods modified with some engineering improvements. We could generate income, prove that sustainable use is viable, create jobs for everyone at Thornwood. And," Eli added, joining the conversation, "we spread the word. We let other homesteaders know what we are doing, invite them to join us. The more people we have, the harder we are to displace." Nayland felt something shift inside her chest, a weight lifting that she had not realized she was carrying. They were not giving up. They were adapting. They were doing exactly what she should have expected from people who had survived everything they had survived. "Then we go back to Thornwood," she said, standing, "and we build what we said we would build. Not because the law gave us permission, but because it is the right thing to build, and we are the right people to build it." The journey back to Thornwood took 3 days, and in that time Nalin felt the strange doubling of reality that comes from living in 2 timelines simultaneously. In one timeline, the official one, she was a property owner whose rights were under investigation, suspended in legal uncertainty, waiting for authorities to decide her fate. In the other timeline, the one she was choosing to live in, she was a guardian of a new kind of community, someone who had been given a mission by her mother and by history, and by the simple fact of people needing a place that the old world had not made room for. When they arrived at Thornwood, more people were waiting than had left for the hearing. Word had spread through the invisible networks that connected marginalized communities, and they had come seeking refuge, seeking purpose, seeking the possibility that they had heard was being built in this unlikely place on the edge of Arizona territory. Nalin stood on the porch of her house, looking out at faces that represented every group that the dominant order had decided did not fully belong, did not fully matter. And she felt the responsibility of it, the terrible weight of being chosen. Not because she was strong enough, but because she was broken in the right ways, because her mixed blood and her losses and her refusal to fit into neat categories made her exactly the person who could hold this impossible thing together. "We lost in court," she said, speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. "The commissioner ruled that Whitmore Mining has a valid claim to the mineral rights beneath this land. But he also ruled that they cannot act on that claim immediately, that there must be investigations and assessments." She paused, let that sink in, saw the disappointment on faces that had hoped for better news. "We have been given time. Not much, perhaps 6 months, perhaps a year. And we have a choice about what we do with that time. We can prepare for defeat, can pack our belongings and search for somewhere else to go, can accept that the world is exactly as harsh as we have always known it to be." Nalin took a breath, felt her mother's necklace heavy against her chest, felt Jacob's presence like a steadying hand. "Or we can use that time to build something so undeniable, so valuable, so essential, that taking it becomes unthinkable. We can prove that sustainable use of resources is possible. We can demonstrate that people from different backgrounds can live together without one group dominating the others. We can create a model that other communities can learn from, can replicate. We can make Thornwood not just a place, but an idea. And ideas, my friends, are much harder to destroy than places." The Apache elder who had led the ceremony a week earlier stood up from where he had been sitting in the shade. "In the old days, when we knew the soldiers were coming, we would sometimes abandon our villages, would scatter into the mountains, would survive by being impossible to pin down. But we also knew that we could not run forever, that eventually we had to make a stand for something worth defending." He looked around at the assembled group. "This is that stand, not because we think we can win against the forces arrayed against us, but because making the stand is itself the victory, because refusing to disappear is itself a form of resistance." Mina spoke up next, her voice quiet but clear. "My father used to say that the best way to predict the future is to build it yourself. We cannot know what the courts will decide, what the government will permit, what the mining company will do. But we can decide what we will build in the time we have. And if what we build is good enough, strong enough, then it will survive whatever happens next." Over the following weeks, Thornwood transformed. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with the steady accumulation of small changes that eventually added up to something entirely new. The Chinese workers, using techniques they had learned building railroads, helped construct irrigation systems that combined Apache traditional knowledge with engineering precision. The Mexican families who knew dry land farming from generations of practice established gardens that produced food with minimal water. The Apache taught everyone how to read the land, how to track weather patterns, how to find water sources that were invisible to those who had not been trained to see. And Nalin, working with Mina's engineering drawings and the Apache elders' knowledge of sacred sites, began the careful work of establishing what they were calling the Thornwood Trust, a legal entity that would own the land communally, that would be governed by a rotating council elected by residents, that would commit to protecting both the environmental integrity and the cultural significance of the property. It was audacious. It was legally questionable. It would probably not hold up if challenged in federal court. But it was real, written on paper, filed with the territorial government before anyone could object, creating a paper trail that would make unraveling it complicated and expensive. And as word spread about what was happening at Thornwood, more people came. Not just the desperate and the displaced, but also a few who had other options, who chose Thornwood because they believed in what it represented. A white doctor who had been ostracized in Denver for treating Chinese patients. A Mexican priest who had been censured by his bishop for arguing that God loved the Apache as much as anyone else. A former Union officer who had become disillusioned with Reconstruction and was looking for a different way to build something worth believing in. 3 months after the hearing in Silver City, a letter arrived from Commissioner Thornhill's office. Nalin opened it with hands that wanted to shake but refused to read the formal language that tried to obscure its meaning in bureaucratic phrasing. The investigation into Whitmore mining had uncovered irregularities in several contracts, but not enough to warrant criminal prosecution. However, the cultural assessment of Thornwood Ranch had revealed significant archaeological resources, including ceremonial sites that predated European contact by several centuries. Therefore, any mining operations would need to be conducted with extreme care to avoid damaging these resources and would require approval from both the Territorial Antiquities Board and representatives of the affected Apache tribes. It was not a victory, but it was not defeat either. It was another delay, another obstacle that Whitmore would have to navigate, another opportunity for Nalin and her community to strengthen their position. But the letter also contained a warning. Vernon Whitmore had filed a lawsuit in federal court arguing that territorial authorities did not have jurisdiction over property rights disputes involving interstate commerce, that the matter should be decided by a federal judge who would not be swayed by local political considerations or sentimental attachment to Indian artifacts. Nalin studied the signature at the bottom. The ink was pressed harder than in previous documents, the letters less controlled. Carver noticed her examining it. "His wife is dying," he said quietly. "Consumption. The doctors give her weeks, maybe days. He's running out of people to build his legacy for." "He is escalating," Carver said after reading the letter. "Taking it to federal court means he is willing to spend whatever it takes, wait as long as necessary. He has made this personal." "Then we make our response equally personal," Nalin said. "We show him that we are not just defending a piece of land. We are defending a principle that threatens everything his world is built on." She gathered her council that evening as the sun set over the red hills, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. They sat in a circle, Apache and Chinese and Mexican and white, old and young, those who had been at Thornwood from the beginning and those who had arrived just days ago. "We need to make a decision," Nalin said. "Whitmore is taking this to federal court. That means a longer fight, more expense, more uncertainty. Some of you may want to leave now to find somewhere safer, somewhere less complicated. I will not hold that against anyone. This fight was mine before it was ours, and if you choose to step away, I will understand." No one moved. No one spoke for a long moment. Then Mina said, "When I was working on the railroad, I saw men die for wages that barely kept them alive. I saw people sacrifice everything for the promise that if they just worked hard enough, endured enough, they would eventually be rewarded. And I saw that promise broken again and again." She looked around the circle. "Here we are sacrificing for something different. Not for wages or promises, but for proof that another way is possible. That is worth staying for. That is worth fighting for." Others spoke after her, each adding their voice, their reasons, their commitment. And Nayland listened to all of it, feeling the way that individual stories wove together into something larger, something that could not be reduced to any single narrative or any single motivation. When everyone had spoken, the Apache elder who had led the ceremony stood and walked to the center of the circle. From a pouch at his waist, he withdrew a small object and held it up for everyone to see. It was a piece of turquoise, unpolished and raw, the kind that came from deep in the earth, where the stone still remembered being part of the living rock. In the old days, he said, when warriors went to battle, they would carry a stone from their homeland, not for luck, but for memory, so that even if they died far from home, they would have a piece of that home with them, so that their spirit would know where to return. He looked at Nalin. You are carrying your mother's stone, the one she gave you before she died. But now you are not just carrying it for yourself, you are carrying it for all of us. So we should give you our stones as well, so that you carry the weight of our commitment, so that you remember you do not fight alone. One by one, people came forward. Some brought stones, others brought other objects that meant home to them. A piece of jade from China, a silver coin from Mexico, a carved wooden cross, a rusted railroad spike, an eagle feather, a worn photograph. Each person placed their object in Nalin's hands, and with each addition she felt the weight grow, felt the responsibility settle deeper into her bones. When the last person had contributed, Nayland had a collection of objects that represented every direction, every history, every hope that had converged at Thornwood. She wrapped them carefully in a cloth, knowing that she would keep them close, that they would remind her of what she was fighting for when the fight became too hard to bear. 6 months passed. The federal lawsuit dragged on, delayed by procedural motions, jurisdictional questions, the slow machinery of a legal system that operated on timelines measured in years rather than human urgency. And in those 6 months, Thornwood became something that no one, not even Nayland, had fully imagined at the beginning. The turquoise mining operation began using traditional Apache methods modified by Mina's engineering. They extracted only small amounts, only what could be taken without damaging the surrounding rock formations, and they sold it to traders who valued the spiritual significance as much as the mineral content. The income was modest, but it proved the concept that resources could be used sustainably, that profit did not require destruction. The agricultural experiments bore fruit literally and figuratively. The gardens produced enough food to feed the community and some surplus to trade. The irrigation systems that combined Apache knowledge with Chinese engineering became so effective that neighboring homesteaders began visiting to learn. The techniques began asking if they could join the Thornwood Trust, began spreading word that there was a place where different kinds of knowledge were valued equally, and the community itself developed rhythms, customs, ways of resolving disputes and making decisions that drew from all the traditions represented but belonged to none of them exclusively. They were inventing something new, not intentionally at first, but through the simple necessity of diverse people trying to live together without anyone being able to claim automatic authority based on race or gender or prior ownership. Nalin watched all of this with a mixture of pride and fear, knowing that the more successful they became, the more threatening they would appear to those who needed the old order to remain unchallenged. Success made them visible. Visibility made them vulnerable. In the 10th month after the hearing in Silver City, Vernon Whitmore arrived at Thornwood unannounced, accompanied only by a driver. No lawyers, no hired guns, no documentation. Just an old man who looked tired in ways that money could not fix. Nalin met him at the boundary of the property, made him walk the last half-mile to the main house so that he could see what had been built, so that he could not avoid witnessing the reality of what he was trying to destroy. They sat on the porch where she had first met with Pinkerton and Carver, where so many conversations that shaped Thornwood's future had taken place. "You have surprised me," Whitmore said without preamble. "I expected you to fight, or to flee, or to collapse under the pressure. I did not expect you to build." "Then you do not understand the people you are fighting," Nayland replied. No, Whitmore agreed. I am beginning to realize that. I have spent my life building a company, an empire, a legacy, and I thought that was enough. But my son died, Mrs. Thorne, my only child, and I realized that everything I built would crumble after I was gone, that I would be forgotten as soon as my money ran out. He looked out at the community that was beginning its evening routines, children playing in the dust, women preparing communal meals, men returning from work in the fields and mines. What you have built here will outlive you, Whitmore said quietly, not because of money or legal documents, but because it means something to people, because it gives them something they cannot find elsewhere. Is that why you came to tell me you admire what you are trying to destroy? I came to make you an offer, not a buyout, not a partnership, something else. Whitmore pulled a folded paper from his coat. This is a deed transferring ownership of the water and mineral rights I was granted by the court back to the Thornwood Trust. No conditions, no payment required. Nayland stared at the paper, not reaching for it. Why? Because I am 72 years old and I am tired of being the villain in everyone's story. Because my wife died last month and I realized I have no one left who will remember me with anything except resentment or fear. Because what you are building here is more important than what I was building, and I am finally old enough to admit that. You murdered my husband, Nayland said quietly. You poisoned my son. You tried to steal my land through fraud and intimidation. And now you want redemption. Whitmore's face crumpled, and for the first time Nayland saw him as something other than an enemy. She saw him as what he was, a broken old man who had spent his life accumulating power and had just now realized that power was not the same as meaning. I did not kill your husband, Whitmore said. That was done by people I hired, but without my explicit orders. They acted on what they thought I wanted, which is perhaps the same thing, and your son, his voice cracked. When I discovered what had been done, I had the men arrested. They're serving 20 years in Yuma Territorial Prison for poisoning your well. It won't bring Daniel back, but they're paying for their crime. Nayland felt something loosen in her chest. Not forgiveness, but the cold satisfaction of knowing Daniel's death had not gone unanswered. But you did not report them immediately, she said. No, because I am a coward, Mrs. Thorne. I waited until after my son died, until I realized that protecting my reputation was protecting nothing worth having. I thought I could still win, could still take what I wanted, without having to acknowledge the cost. Nayland took the deed from his hands, unfolded. It read the legal language that transferred everything he had fought so hard to claim. It was legitimate. It was notarized. It was effective immediately. This does not erase what was done, she said. I know, but it might make the future different from the past, and that is all any of us can hope for. Whitmore stood, moved toward his carriage, then turned back. I do not expect forgiveness, Mrs. Thorne, but I hope that someday when people tell the story of this place, they will say that at least at the end I made the right choice. Nayland watched him drive away the deed heavy in her hands. She thought about all the things she wanted to say, all the rage she wanted to express, all the justice she wanted to demand for Jacob and Daniel and everyone else who had suffered because of men like Whitmore. But she also thought about her mother's words from the journal, about how some things are worth more than survival, worth more than revenge, about how transformation was more powerful than victory. She gathered her council that evening and presented them with the deed. There was celebration, tears, disbelief that their impossible fight had somehow ended, not with destruction but with surrender, not with loss but with gain. But Nayland tempered their celebration with a warning. We won, she said, but not because the system worked. We won because one old man at the end of his life chose to do something decent. We cannot rely on that happening again. We cannot assume that other land companies, other mining interests, other agents of the old order will suddenly see the light and hand us what we need. She looked around at the faces that had become her family, her community, her reason for continuing. This is not the end. It is barely the beginning. Now we have to prove that what we built can survive not just opposition, but success. We have to show that a diverse community can govern itself wisely, can use resources sustainably, can create something worth protecting without falling into the same patterns of domination and exploitation that we opposed. "That is a tall order," Carver said with a slight smile. "Almost as tall as defeating a mining company through legal maneuvering and moral pressure." "Almost," Nalin agreed. "But we have already done the impossible once. Perhaps we can do it again." 5 years later, on a clear autumn day, when the air smelled like sage and the red hills glowed in the late afternoon sun, Nayland stood at the edge of the Thornwood Trust territory and watched a delegation from the territorial government arrive for their annual inspection. The trust had grown to encompass not just the original ranch, but several adjacent properties whose owners had chosen to join the experiment to commit their land to the collective governance model, to become part of something larger than individual ownership. There were now 300 permanent residents, with another 100 who came and went seasonally, working the mines or the fields or the craft workshops that had sprung up to take advantage of diverse skills and knowledge. They had built a school where children learned in English, Spanish, Apache, and Cantonese. They had established a council that rotated leadership every 2 years, ensuring that no single person or group could dominate decision-making. They had created an economic system that blended communal ownership with individual initiative, allowing people to profit from their labor while ensuring that the land itself could not be sold or exploited beyond sustainable limits. It was imperfect. There were conflicts, misunderstandings, moments when the whole enterprise seemed ready to collapse under the weight of its internal contradictions. But it survived. It adapted. It continued to prove that the bridge Mina's father had talked about could hold weight, could carry traffic, could span the distance between worlds that were supposed to remain forever separate. Nalin was 43 now, her hair showing more gray, her face marked by the years of stress and struggle. But she moved with the quiet authority of someone who had earned her place not through birth or wealth, but through the slow accumulation of choices that prioritized community over personal gain, principle over expedience. Carver walked with her to meet the delegation, his own hair now completely white, his body slower, but his mind as sharp as ever. He had become the Trust's primary liaison with territorial authorities, using his knowledge of the system to navigate the endless bureaucratic requirements, the inspections and certifications, and legal questions that arose whenever you tried to do something that did not fit into existing categories. "They are going to ask about succession planning," Carver said quietly, "about what happens when you die, about whether this whole thing collapses without your leadership. And we will tell them the truth," Nayland replied, "that I am not the leader, that leadership here is distributed, rotational, communal, that the whole point is to create something that does not depend on any single person." They will not understand that. No, but they do not need to understand it. They only need to see that it works. The inspection went well. The territorial officials examined the mining operations, the agricultural systems, the governance structures. They interviewed residents, reviewed financial records, assessed the environmental impact. And at the end of 3 days, they issued a report that, while noting some irregularities and unconventional practices, concluded that the Thornwood Trust territory was successfully managing its resources in a sustainable manner and providing economic opportunity for a diverse population. It was not a ringing endorsement, but it was official recognition, government acknowledgement that what they were doing was legitimate, was valuable, was worth preserving. After the officials left, Nayland walked alone to the Red Hills, to the cave where she had first discovered the truth about her mother's legacy and Jacob's mission. The ceremonial objects were still there, preserved and protected by the community that now understood their significance. The journals were kept in a small library that had been built in the main settlement, available for anyone to read, to learn from, to contribute to. She sat in the cave entrance, watching the sun set over the land that was hers, and not hers, that belonged to everyone, and no one that existed in the spaces between ownership and stewardship, between individual and collective, between the past that had been destroyed and the future that was still becoming. Daniel would be 17 now. He would have grown up bilingual, trilingual, learning to move between cultures as easily as between rooms in a house. Jacob would have stood here with her, marveling at how protection had transformed into creation. And her mother, somehow she had seen this, planted these seeds, knowing harvest belonged to other hands. And she thought about herself, about the journey from being a woman who belonged nowhere to being a woman who had created a place where belonging itself was redefined, where the question was not whether you fit into existing categories, but whether you were willing to help build new ones. As darkness fell and stars emerged bright and cold and indifferent to human concerns, Nalin spoke aloud to the people who were gone to the spirits that her mother had believed watched over sacred places, to whatever force in the universe cared about the small, brave attempts of broken people trying to make something beautiful from their brokenness. "We did it," she said. "Not perfectly, not completely, but we built the bridge. We created the labyrinth. We proved that another way was possible. And whether it survives for a generation or a century or collapses tomorrow, at least we proved it could exist at all. At least we showed that the world did not have to be organized the way powerful men insisted it must be organized." The wind carried her words away, mixing them with the sounds of the community below, the sounds of people living and working and arguing and celebrating, the sounds of life continuing in all its messy, complicated glory. Nalin Tse Da Thorn, daughter of two worlds, guardian of a place that belonged to all worlds, and none had done what she set out to do. She had protected the sacred not by hiding it, but by revealing it in a way that made it too valuable to destroy. She had turned vulnerability into strength, mixed blood into wisdom, rejection into the foundation for radical acceptance. The labyrinth was complete. Not a maze of walls and traps designed to kill intruders, but a complex network of relationships and commitments designed to sustain life. And anyone who entered it with respect, with openness, with willingness to be transformed by the journey, would find that the path led not to a dead end, but to a center that was always expanding, always making room for one more person who did not fit anywhere else. That was the true victory. Not defeating enemies, but transforming enmity into something new. Not preserving the past, but creating a future that honored the past without being imprisoned by it. And as Nalin walked back down to the settlement, back to the people who had become her family, she carried with her the knowledge that some battles are won not through force but through persistence, not through domination but through demonstration, not through claiming power but through sharing it so widely that it ceased to be power in the traditional sense and became instead something closer to grace. The Apache widow's labyrinth was no longer just a defensive structure. It had become a living thing, growing and changing, a proof of concept for a world that had not yet been fully imagined, but was slowly, painfully, beautifully coming into being with every choice made by every person who decided that belonging together was worth the difficulty of figuring out how to do it. And that was enough, more than enough, everything,